I never thought the ventilation shaft could feel so alive until last night, when the rhythmic thumping mirrored my heartbeat and refused to stop even after I'd checked every panel twice. My hands were shaking as I realized that each movement I made might be watched, measured, cataloged, though there was no one in sight. 11 strange rules had been drilled into me during my training, promises I'd never fully questioned until I heard the whispers responding to my mistakes. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, that I was just tired, but the faint repetition of my own voice answering back made me pause. Something is waiting, just out of view, and it knows I noticed. I remember the first time I ignored Rule 1, never enter the ventilation shafts alone, no matter how safe they seem. It wasn't even a big shaft, just one of the side passages they say technicians never need to use unless something's broken. I thought I could slip through, quick and quiet, just to check a panel I suspected was misaligned. The metal under my fingertips was colder than the surrounding air, unnaturally so, and as I moved forward, I felt a weight pressing against my chest, like the shaft itself was breathing. I told myself it was just nerves, that exhaustion was making the shadows seem alive, but every inch I crawled deeper, the walls felt less solid, more sentient. The next moment, I realized I wasn't alone, or at least something was. I could sense it shifting somewhere beyond the narrow grates, responding to me, though I didn't dare stop to confirm it. My hand slipped on the rim of a ventilation panel, and for a heartbeat the silence stretched until it felt like the entire platform had stopped spinning. Just my imagination, I whispered to myself, trying to anchor reality to my voice, but the echo came back wrong, slightly delayed, as if something else was practicing speaking through me. That's when I understood that breaking Rule 1 wasn't about punishment, it was about survival, and I'd just crossed a line I didn't fully comprehend. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but part of me had already committed. I could feel the shaft constricting, not physically, but psychologically, like the space was aware of my guilt. Each breath I drew was mirrored by a whisper that wasn't mine, faintly, impossibly precise, as if the shadows themselves were repeating the rhythm of my lungs. I tried to focus on the lights at the end of the passage, but they flickered in response to my panic, making it impossible to gauge distance or direction. Even the tools I had slipped from my belt felt heavier, almost resisting my touch, like the rules themselves were tangible and punishing me for my curiosity. Hours or maybe minutes, I could no longer tell, passed as I crept deeper. The walls started reflecting faint images of myself, slightly wrong, each one mouthing the same phrase I didn't speak. I tried to tell myself it was fatigue, that no one could really be in here, but my reflection in a metallic seam turned its head before I did, and the echo of my own gasp felt like someone else's. I remembered Rule 1, never enter the ventilation shafts alone, no matter how safe they seem. In a flash of shame so sharp, it made my stomach lurch. That memory alone should have pulled me back, but instead it tethered me further into the maze, every turn folding in on itself, impossible and alive. Somewhere along the shaft, I heard a faint scraping, like nails on the metal interior, and it wasn't above me or below me, it was all around me. I stopped moving, hoping to hear nothing, but the moment I froze, the echo of my own heartbeat slowed in mockery, stretched into something alien. I could feel the platform above me continuing with normal operations, unaware, indifferent, while the ventilation system seemed to exist in its own distorted reality. Every panel I passed reminded me of the rules we were given, and Rule 1, the one I broke so carelessly, was suddenly the only thing keeping me anchored to reason. By the time I reached what I thought was the far end, the shaft had changed. The familiar bends and grates had become a labyrinth, some sections taller than they should be, others impossibly narrow. I realized I had no idea how long I had been down there. My watch had stopped, or perhaps the time had stopped responding to me. I wanted to call out, to scream, to force someone to acknowledge my presence, but my voice came back too late, distorted, like I was hearing my own fear after it had already passed. And then the whisper returned, repeating my name, or something like it, over and over, just beyond comprehension. proving that Rule 1 was never about being careful, it was about staying sane. At some point, I began leaving marks on the walls, thinking I could track my way back, but every mark seemed to vanish when I looked away. The ventilation shaft wasn't just a passage anymore, it was a living maze, correcting itself around me. Shadows pooled in corners that didn't exist before, and faint lights glimmered as if mocking me, too precise to be coincidental. My hands shook uncontrollably, not just from fear, but from an instinctual realization that I had trespassed into something older and more patient than any human crew. I thought about the other rules, the 10 I hadn't broken yet, and the cold certainty that Rule 1 was the first domino. Eventually, I thought I saw an exit, a grate illuminated by the emergency lights, but as I reached for it, the shaft expanded, elongating impossibly, pushing the exit just out of reach. I could feel my mind fraying at the edges, each breath was heavier than the last, and I started talking to the walls as if they were people, begging them not to twist reality further. The shadows responded, sometimes perfectly, sometimes with delays that made me question my own memory. I remembered every warning about the shafts, every anecdote from senior technicians, and the repeated mantra, Rule 1, never enter the ventilation shafts alone, no matter how safe they seem. It had been repeated as a joke in training, but now it was a lifeline, and I had ignored it. By the time I stumbled into a junction that felt vaguely familiar, I realized the ventilation system had no logic. Corridors looped into themselves, some leading to walls, others opening into rooms I didn't recognize. My sense of time was gone, replaced by a slow, creeping terror that the shaft itself could reshape reality based on my panic. I tried to retrace my path, but the marks I'd made to find my way back were now symbols I didn't recognize, etched by some unseen hand. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to accept the rule I had broken, yet the maze didn't allow it. My own footsteps sounded wrong, echoed differently than they should, and the first shadow of doubt crept into my mind. I finally came to a section where the air was thicker, heavier, almost viscous. My movements became sluggish, as if the shaft itself resisted me. I realized my fear had made me reckless, but it wasn't just fear, it was the first step into understanding that Rule 1 had always been about trust, and I had no one to trust now, except the walls that were shifting around me. A faint whisper said something I couldn't understand, but the tone carried absolute certainty. I had trespassed into a system that measured, weighted, and judged every action. My legs trembled, my hands burned from gripping the metal, and I began to question whether I had ever actually known the layout of the platform at all, and that's when I stopped, for no logical reason. Somewhere deep in the shaft, the shadows paused too. The faint echo of my earlier whispers returned, perfectly timed, confirming that this place had a memory I couldn't override. I realized then that even if I somehow found my way out, I would carry the consequences of ignoring Rule 1. Never enter the ventilation shafts alone, no matter how safe they seem, forever, not as scars but as an understanding that the rules weren't optional, they were obligations, silently enforced by something patient, something that waited for mistakes. And as I finally moved toward what I hoped was an exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shaft had already decided how this would end. The moment I stepped back into the main corridor, my eyes were drawn to the control panels blinking unevenly, each light stuttering as if uncertain about its own existence. I remembered the warning, Rule 2, never touch the control panels when the lights flicker, even briefly. And yet my hand inched toward one, compelled by a strange mix of curiosity and dread. The panel hummed faintly, almost apologetically, and I could feel my pulse sinking with the flicker, as if the lights themselves were drawing me in. My mind was buzzing, whispering contradictions. Part of me knew this was a trap, but another part wanted confirmation, a tangible proof that I still understood how the platform worked. Every instinct screamed to stop, yet my fingers hovered over the cold, blinking buttons. As soon as I brushed the surface, a shock ran through my head, not electric, not physical, but a piercing clarity that made me see the platform in ways I couldn't comprehend. I saw corridors twisting in impossible angles, doors opening where they shouldn't, shadows moving independently of their owners. The flickering lights had become a rhythm, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't tell whether I was controlling it or it was controlling me. My own thoughts echoed back in distorted phrases I didn't recognize, and I whispered to myself, I shouldn't have touched it, but my voice was returned slightly delayed, like the system was practicing mimicking me. The realization hit that Rule 2 wasn't about avoiding danger in a traditional sense. It was about avoiding madness. Hours, or maybe seconds, passed in this disorienting feedback loop. Each time I tried to focus, the panel flickered, and I felt a small part of myself unravel. Memories of my training sessions came unbidden, each lecture about safety and procedure, twisting into something grotesque. I tried to call a colleague over the comm, but the voice that answered sounded like mine, speaking words I hadn't said. Panic rose in my chest, but it wasn't the fear of immediate harm. It was the creeping knowledge that my perception of reality was being rewritten, slowly, methodically, by something patient and deliberate. The corridor itself seemed to pulse, synchronizing with the flickering lights, and my own accelerating heartbeat. I stumbled backward, trying to escape the control panel's influence, but the corridor didn't obey logic anymore. Walls elongated, lights that should have stayed dim flared suddenly, and the metal grating under my boots felt liquid, almost imperceptibly shifting with every step. My mind began filling in impossible gaps, imagining exits where none existed, hearing distant voices that repeated snippets of my own thoughts. I felt exposed, vulnerable in ways that didn't make physical sense, as if Rule 2 was a boundary between the sane and the unspeakable. Each flicker wasn't just a light, it was a fracture in the world around me, and touching the panels had opened my perception to something I could never unsee. By the time I forced myself to a maintenance room, I could feel the subtle tremors in my own hands, not from exhaustion, but from the insidious pull of the flickering lights I'd interacted with. Every time I closed my eyes, the panels returned, glowing faintly behind my eyelids, mocking me, reminding me of the choice I'd made. I whispered over and over, I shouldn't have touched it, feeling my own voice layer with the echoes of something else that seemed to know the layout better than I ever could. The walls of the room appeared to breathe slightly, expanding and contracting in rhythms that matched the stuttering panels. I realized my senses were no longer just mine, and I was terrified of what was now listening inside my head. A low hum started from somewhere above, rising and falling like a tide, carrying with it fragments of memory I hadn't thought about in years. Faces of coworkers, conversations I'd had during routine inspections, all filtered through a lens that distorted them, sometimes making them sinister, sometimes painfully familiar. I tried to focus on the practical, on systems and procedures, but the moment I thought I understood, the lights flickered again, and I was plunged into the same rhythm, the same pull, the same slow creeping sense that reality itself was bending. My fingers twitched toward another panel despite myself, and I realized that Rule 2 never touched the control panels when the lights flicker, even briefly, had been more than a rule. It was a boundary I had willingly crossed. Hours slipped into something unmeasurable. I paced the maintenance room, listening to the soft, uneven hum, trying to convince myself I was still human, still capable of rational thought. The shadows lengthened and shortened in ways that made no sense, sometimes reflecting my movements with a delay so precise it felt like mockery. I began noticing patterns in the flicker, rhythms I couldn't unhear, cycles that seemed to anticipate my own impulses. The knowledge weighed on me, a slow rod inside my mind, making me question not only what was real, but whether I had ever been in control at all. I shivered, realizing the platform had taught me something I wasn't ready to understand. I tried to reach the comms again, hoping for a lifeline, but the voice that answered wasn't a lifeline. It was a distorted version of me, recounting my own doubts in a cadence I didn't recognize. I pressed the buttons, slammed them with my fists, and the flicker responded, almost in amusement, aligning with my frantic rhythm. Panic gave way to nausea, and I collapsed against the wall, feeling the hum resonate through my bones. rewriting my perception of space, time, and myself. I knew then that Rule 2 wasn't just a guideline, it was a protective measure for the mind, one that I had carelessly overridden, and the consequences were unfolding with surgical precision. Eventually, I dragged myself out of the maintenance room, each step heavy with the certainty that the corridors themselves had memorized my fear. The lights continued their erratic dance, following me, anticipating me, and the distant sounds of machinery seemed slower, distorted, like they existed on a slightly different timeline than I did. Every reflection in the metal panels, every shadow stretching unnaturally across the walls, was a reminder that touching those flickering controls had changed me. I could feel my own mind bending around the rules I had once taken for granted, and the creeping certainty that the platform, the lights, and the shadows had been waiting for someone to make that mistake. By the time I reached the junction where the ventilation shaft had ended, my perception of time had fractured completely. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes collapsed into something unmeasurable, and I began questioning whether the previous events had even happened, or if I was trapped in a loop of my own creation. I whispered to myself, I must never touch the panels again, feeling the weight of Rule 2, never touch the control panels when the lights flicker, even briefly, settling into my bones. But even that mantra felt inadequate, a fragile shield against the slowly gnawing presence of something that had learned my patterns, my mistakes, and was waiting for the next lapse. The first time I heard it, my stomach dropped. A soft, almost casual whisper drifted through the narrow metal passage. Usman, Usman, and even though I told myself it was just the wind, the echo didn't behave naturally. I remembered Rule 3. Never respond when you hear your name called in empty corridors. A memory from training that I had dismissed as overcaution, and yet my lips moved before I could stop them, murmuring back, "Who's there?" Instantly, the corridor stretched, lights dimming as if disapproving, and the familiar hum of machinery became jagged, impatient, aware. I felt exposed, like stepping outside a fragile bubble where my mistakes were now visible to someone, or something that never blinked. I froze as the whisper repeated, a fraction slower this time, mimicking not just my words but my hesitation. I told myself to move forward, that ignoring it would keep me safe, but every instinct screamed that the corridor was alive, watching, cataloging, learning from my response. Shadows pooled unnaturally along the walls, gathering at intersections I knew were empty, and the metal grating beneath me hummed in alignment with my quickened heartbeat. I tried to convince myself it was fatigue, the isolation of the platform after hours of night shifts, yet the air itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with the whispers, each repetition drawing me deeper into doubt. As I walked further, every sound was amplified, the scraping of tools in the distance, the faint shift of a panel, even my own breathing. The whispers grew more patient, more deliberate, carrying tones I didn't recognize at first. I had to remind myself of Rule 3, the command that was now a fragile tether: never respond. My own instinct to answer was strong, almost magnetic, like the shadowed corridors were reaching through me, tugging at my lips to confirm their presence. I caught myself pressing my hands to my ears, murmuring nonsense, hoping that if I ignored the voice long enough, it would disappear. But it never did. Hours, or the perception of hours, stretched as I wandered the platform's upper decks alone. The corridors no longer made sense. I would enter a section I had passed only moments before, and find the walls slightly shifted, the lights flickering differently. Each time the whisper returned, my name repeating with an imperceptible delay, accompanied by breaths that weren't mine. The solitude became suffocating. I remembered every anecdote from senior technicians about isolation in the late-night shifts, but none of them had ever described the feeling that the empty corridors were actively trying to convince you that you were already gone. My skin crawled, every shadow a potential speaker, every reflection a mirror of someone waiting to respond. I tried to talk myself down, muttering rational explanations, imagining drafts or the machinery's natural vibrations. But even as I reasoned, the voice adjusted, subtle inflections threading through the metallic air, convincing me that the building itself was aware of my fear. I caught glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, shapes that disappeared when I turned, leaving only the echo of my own name vibrating in the walls. The platform, once a familiar structure, had become a labyrinth designed to isolate me, to erode the boundary between thought and hallucination. The weight of Rule 3, never respond when you hear your name called in empty corridors, anchored me briefly, a warning I had now internalized too late. I stopped at a junction I thought I recognized and tried to peer down multiple corridors at once, calculating my path back to the central console. Each route seemed plausible, yet subtly wrong. My own footsteps returned differently than expected, sometimes too late, sometimes slightly ahead of me, making me question whether I had moved at all. The whispers returned again, softer now, coaxing, almost intimate, repeating my name with tiny variations. I could feel my heart in my throat as I told myself, "Do not respond," repeating it like a mantra, and yet the corridors themselves seemed to murmur back, shaping the shadows and lights to mock my hesitation. I stumbled into a maintenance alcove, thinking it might provide a moment of clarity, but the narrow room was suffocating, the air vibrating with the faint repetition of my name. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to block the sound, trying to convince myself that silence would protect me. But the voice adjusted its tone again, soft and deliberate, sometimes far, sometimes impossibly close. I whispered, "Please, just leave me alone," hoping the words would anchor reality, but they returned in distortion, the syllables warped and delayed. My mind began filling gaps I hadn't noticed, imagining people standing just outside my field of vision, watching, listening, judging. Hours or some fractured measure of time passed, and the voice never relented. Every junction, every stairwell, every metal grate seemed poised to repeat my name. I realized that Rule 3 wasn't just a precaution, it was a lifeline, the only thing separating reality from the slowly encroaching certainty that the platform itself was sentient and had marked me. I could feel my own mind fraying at the edges, paranoia gnawing at my judgment, making me doubt not just my surroundings but my memory, my decisions, even my own name. I kept moving, trying to find the central console or any familiar marker, but each step made the whisper stronger, adapting, repeating variations of my name with calculated patience. I started murmuring other words under my breath, fragments of numbers, tool names, anything to distract, but the voice ignored them, waiting for my failure. I was utterly alone, yet I could feel the presence of the corridors pressing against me, bending the space to ensure I would hear what I should never answer. The weight of isolation grew heavier with every attempt to flee, the metallic air thickening with unseen eyes. By the time I reached a maintenance ladder leading down, I was trembling uncontrollably. The whisper followed, twisting my own voice back at me, in ways I could barely recognize, each echo shaping the space, each pause teaching the corridors how to manipulate my perception. Shadows pooled in corners that shouldn't exist, walls shifted subtly when I wasn't looking, and I realized with a cold certainty that the platform had learned my habits, my fears, my responses. Rule 3, never respond when you hear your name called in empty corridors, wasn't a suggestion, it was a shield I had only just discovered, too late to trust fully. I hesitated on the ladder, staring down into darkness that seemed to breathe, the whisper repeating one final variation of my name before falling silent. I wanted to move, but the isolation had broken me enough to feel that any motion might trigger a response I wasn't ready to face. The corridors were patient, unhurried, and I was suddenly a small, fragile element in a system that could wait centuries if necessary. I realized that I might never leave the shadowed decks intact, my mind already fraying, a whisper away from unraveling entirely. I found the flickering beacon in the East Wing's machinery deck and froze. The light was uneven, pulsing faintly, and I remembered Rule 4, never leave a malfunctioning safety beacon unreported, no matter how minor it seems. The warning echoing in my mind as a cold, pressing weight. My first instinct was to fix it quietly, hoping no one would notice, but I hesitated, thinking the shift had been long enough that someone else would see it. The platform groaned, as if agreeing with my indecision, and I realized my choice, or my inaction, had already been noted. Every second I waited, the guilt gnawed at me, sharp and immediate, like the beacon itself was judging my reluctance. I finally grabbed a toolkit, hands trembling, trying to force myself into action, but each time I reached for the faulty wires, I saw flashes of the other maintenance incidents that had gone wrong. I remembered colleagues, some I had laughed with, some I had argued with, all tied to beacons that had been ignored, overlooked, or left for later. The realization hit hard. Every small mistake, every moment I chose convenience over protocol, might have already shaped irreversible consequences. The beacon's faint flicker reflected in my goggles, each pulse a heartbeat, a reminder of the lives that could depend on these tiny lights. As I worked, my mind replayed the countless warnings drilled during training, but they now carried a weight I hadn't felt before. Each tool I touched seemed to remember the negligence of prior shifts, my own failings mirrored in their cold metal. I whispered apologies into the air, half expecting them to return in distorted echoes, reminding me that Rule 4 wasn't just about lights. It was about responsibility, the kind that could consume you from the inside. The platform seemed aware of my hesitation, the corridors vibrating with my guilt, teaching me that survival wasn't only about physical safety, but moral attentiveness. I thought of the ventilation shaft incident, the flickering panels, the corridors calling my name, and realized that my failures were cumulative. Each choice not to follow a rule had led me here, trapped in a reality where consequences were subtle but inexorable. The beacon, insignificant on the surface, felt like the pivot point of everything I had already done wrong. I kept seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, fleeting glimpses that made me question whether the guilt itself had taken a form, a presence patrolling the platform's dim corners, keeping count of mistakes I had brushed off in my arrogance. Sweat poured down my face as I corrected the wiring, knowing that even this act of repair couldn't undo my hesitation. The soft hum of the platform system seemed heavier, pressing into my chest as if reminding me that Rule 4, never leave a malfunctioning safety beacon unreported, no matter how minor it seems, was not optional. I felt each heartbeat amplify, each pulse a testimony to my awareness of potential catastrophe. I whispered, "It's fixed, it's fixed," but even the words felt hollow, like they were swallowed by the walls, rebounding only to remind me of how long I had waited. When the repair finally completed, I lingered, unwilling to move, staring at the faint, steady light. The relief I expected never came. Instead, a sharp pang of responsibility lodged in my chest. I realized that my mind, already fraying from shadows and whispers, now carried an extra weight. I could save lives or doom them in silence, and the platform seemed to know which choice I had made. Every corridor, every panel, every flickering light reminded me that survival was a constant ledger, and my name had already been recorded in several entries I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The guilt didn't fade as I left the machinery deck. Every step forward reminded me that I had almost ignored a critical signal, that the smallest oversight could snowball into disaster. I kept thinking of voices I might have saved, or failed, and the memory of each one pressed against my chest like a physical force. I whispered reassurances I didn't feel, telling myself that fixing the beacon was enough, but the shadows around me seemed to thicken, acknowledging my partial redemption, but reminding me of the larger debt I still carried. The platform itself had no mercy, and neither did the rules I had been trained to obey. I paused at the stairwell landing, the faint lights of the beacon casting long shadows across the metal floors. My reflection in a polished panel startled me, not because of its resemblance, but because it looked exhausted, hollowed out, carrying the weight of every failure I hadn't even consciously acknowledged. I felt my body tighten, every muscle braced for judgment. Somewhere deep within, the creeping sense of isolation from the earlier corridors mixed with survival guilt, a cocktail of anxiety that made me realize that Rule 4 was as much about psychological endurance as operational safety. I had survived physical threats before, but moral mistakes lingered differently, gnawing silently. I tried to focus on the next tasks, to push the guilt aside, but the flickering light of the beacon haunted my peripheral vision. I imagined what might have happened had I left it alone, imagining cascading failures, alarms, possibly lives lost. I whispered apologies again, not expecting an answer, but feeling the heavy presence of unspoken consequences wrap around me, a reminder that neglect was measured here as meticulously as any mechanical failure. I realized that the platform's silent awareness had no room for mistakes, and my mind, already stretched thin by previous encounters, was now another panel flickering with uncertainty. By the time I returned to the main corridor, I could feel a persistent tremor in my chest, not from exertion, but from the weight of understanding that negligence carried far deeper repercussions than I had anticipated. Each shadow along the walls seemed to remember my hesitation, following me with soft, almost imperceptible awareness. I whispered to myself, I won't let it happen again, feeling that Rule 4, never leave a malfunctioning safety beacon unreported, no matter how minor it seems, had drilled itself into my conscience permanently. Yet even as I moved on, a nagging unease lingered, a quiet reminder that survival was not just about obeying the rules, it was about living with the consequences when you almost didn't. I stumbled into the south wing and froze, staring at a corridor that felt vaguely familiar and yet entirely wrong. The walls, the panels, even the railings seemed to have shifted slightly, as if the platform had rewritten itself while I wasn't looking. I remembered Rule 5, never rely on your memory of the platform during night shifts. It will lie to you. The warning echoing coldly, and I realized with a jolt that every step I thought I knew, every turn I was confident about, could betray me. The memory of previous shifts, my routes, my shortcuts, the maintenance alcoves, began slipping like sand through my fingers, fragments rearranging themselves into something almost recognizable, but not quite. My mind strained to reconcile the platform I remembered with the one in front of me, and the dissonance made my pulse spike. I tried retracing my steps from the beacon incident, but the corridor stretched impossibly, and doors I had just passed were now behind me, leading into spaces that didn't exist in my recollection. My memory, once reliable, now mocked me. I whispered fragments of names and panel numbers, hoping to anchor reality, but the platform mirrored them differently, subtly altering the numbers, shifting letters just out of reach. I realized that the shadows, the flickers, even the faint echoes of my own voice were participating, slowly corrupting every trace of what I thought I knew. The realization hit like ice. Rule 5 wasn't just a precaution, it was a survival necessity, and I had already ignored it enough to notice the consequences. Every time I tried to retrace a step, the platform's layout twisted in ways that made no mechanical sense. The stairwell I had used moments ago now seemed longer, the railing higher, the steps echoing differently than expected. I thought I remembered reaching a junction where a maintenance hatch should be, but it was gone, replaced by a wall I could swear had never existed. Panic started to bubble, not from immediate danger, but from the creeping awareness that my mind could no longer trust its own recollection. I whispered to myself, "This isn't real, it's not real," but even those words felt borrowed, distorted, and I began to doubt whether I had spoken them at all. The faint hum of machinery became irregular, stuttering in rhythm with my heartbeat. I tried to recall the layout of the ventilation shafts, the panels I had touched, the stairwells I had descended, but the memories seemed to rearrange themselves as soon as I focused on them. I found myself repeating mental checklists, each attempt ending in frustration as details slipped away, replaced by something unfamiliar. The platform itself seemed to watch, subtly guiding my thoughts, reshaping my recollections to test my attention, to see if I could distinguish truth from fabrication. Every familiar landmark was now suspect, and the shadows seemed to deepen where memory faltered. I paused at a control panel, I thought I had memorized, the one in the east machinery deck, only to find its light slightly different than expected. I touched the surface cautiously, half expecting it to hum warnings in response to my recognition. My fingers traced familiar grooves, but the numbers displayed were subtly shifted, almost imperceptibly, and I had to blink several times to believe I saw what I saw. I whispered the mantra in my head, reminding myself of Rule 5. Never rely on your memory of the platform during night shifts. It will lie to you. But even the repetition offered only faint reassurance. Every instinct I had relied on was now a suspect guide, and the shadows around me seemed to know every lapse. As I moved deeper into the south wing, I tried leaving small marks on walls and doors to track my progress, but the markings themselves began to appear altered whenever I looked away. Lines that had been straight curved, letters that spelled exit blurred into nonsense, and I began to fear that even my own handwriting could no longer be trusted. I whispered fragments of the rules aloud, hoping sound could anchor truth where memory failed, but the echoes returned subtly twisted, fragments rearranged, emphasizing different words than I had spoken. The realization settled cold in my chest. My mind had become part of the platform's mechanism, every lapse, every hesitation feeding its subtle manipulation. I reached a stairwell I believed led back to the main deck, only to find it longer, darker, and more narrow than I had remembered. My past recollections seemed to collide with the present, producing impossible angles, walls bending where physics shouldn't allow. I realized that every error I had made previously, the shaft, the panels, the beacon, had already primed my mind to misremember, and the platform seemed to exploit it, feeding distortions to keep me off balance. I whispered warnings to myself, fragments of Rule 5, but they were fragile against the weight of shifting perception, and I felt the first pangs of real terror, not from what I could see, but from what I might have already misremembered. At one junction, I was sure I had been there before, but a shadow slid past the wall, a subtle flicker that didn't align with my memory of lighting. I realized with a cold certainty that the platform had been rearranging spaces subtly, testing my trust and recollection. I tried retracing the ventilation shaft exit, focusing intently on each detail, but each glance confirmed the horror. Corridors warped, panels shifted, even the angle of light seemed wrong. I whispered to myself that I needed to trust something, anything, but the only truth left was the platform itself, patient and precise, teaching me that memory was now my greatest enemy. I tried to find familiar markers, hoping my subconscious could detect constancy, but everything had become suspect. Even the beacons I had repaired earlier now seemed to pulse inconsistently, betraying their previous steadiness. I questioned whether the shadows themselves remembered differently, moving in ways that aligned with a version of reality I didn't recognize. The flickers, the echoes, the weight of guilt and isolation, all coalesced into a single pressure point in my mind, testing my endurance. I whispered fragments of Rule 5 to anchor myself, but even the repetition felt tenuous, fragile, as if the platform was waiting for the precise moment I would fail. By the time I stumbled into what I hoped was a maintenance alcove, the world had shifted again, corridors elongating, lights dimming, shadows pooling at impossible angles. My mind, already frayed, could no longer distinguish remembered sequences from hallucinations. I whispered apologies into the empty space, not for anyone in particular, but for every misstep, every misremembered corridor, every lapse that might have caused unseen consequences. I realized then that memory wasn't a tool I could rely on anymore. It was a trap, bending every thought, every decision, and every sense of self to the platform's design. I noticed it first in the northern catwalk, where a single step seemed to stretch longer than physics should allow, and the faint hum of the platform no longer aligned with my heartbeat. Rule 6. Never assume a minute here is the same as a minute anywhere else, had been a guideline I'd always taken lightly, until the stairwell before me stretched like a rubber band, elongating each second into something unbearable. My wristwatch spun erratically, its hands sometimes standing still, sometimes leaping forward in impossible bursts, and I couldn't trust anything I had learned about time. Shadows didn't follow consistent patterns either. Sometimes they lagged, sometimes they anticipated me, and every attempt to pace myself felt like a negotiation with a reality that refused logic. I stumbled forward, counting my steps, hoping to impose some human rhythm onto the chaos. But the platform refused to comply. I would think a corridor was short, then realize it had doubled in length while I blinked. When I paused, the flickering lights above seemed to hang mid-cycle, leaving half-illuminated walls that contradicted every memory of the layout. I whispered to myself that it didn't matter, that I had to keep moving, yet every second stretched into eternity. The rhythm of my own body became untrustworthy, each breath either too long or too short, creating a dissonance that made the shadows seem alive, almost sentient, adjusting themselves to my perception. As I reached the central maintenance bay, I noticed the beacons I had repaired earlier flickering irregularly, some pulses longer, some shorter, no pattern I could comprehend. My mind tried to force logic on them, counting the cycles, trying to synchronize with my own sense of elapsed time, but each attempt failed. I realized that Rule 6 wasn't about clocks or watches. It was about anchoring sanity. Time here was malleable, bending around my movements and my mistakes, punishing me subtly, reshaping my understanding of cause and effect. Every delay, every accelerated pulse, every flicker of light added weight to my panic, dragging my thoughts into a spiral I couldn't escape. I attempted to check a nearby panel for operational timestamps, hoping to ground myself, but the numbers displayed didn't make sense. Hours passed in what I felt were minutes. Minutes lingered like hours. My mind refused to track them accurately, and I began whispering fragments of the rules aloud, trying to impose order with sound, repeating Rule 6, never assume a minute here is the same as a minute anywhere else, hoping that vocalizing it would act as a tether. But even the echoes returned unpredictably, delayed or slightly ahead, reinforcing the untrustworthiness of time. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and compress in rhythm with the temporal distortions, heightening my disorientation. I started pacing, counting every footfall, attempting to mark intervals by physical movement rather than clocks, but the platform mocked even that method. Stairwells shifted while I climbed, distances stretching and compressing unpredictably. When I turned a corner, a section of hallway I had passed moments before appeared identical yet subtly altered, and I couldn't tell whether I had looped or the corridor had rewritten itself. Each second felt negotiable, flexible, like I had been dropped into a liquid flow of time that obeyed no rules I understood. The platform wasn't just a machine, it was a time anomaly, patient and precise, waiting for me to fail to distinguish elapsed moments. I tried to reach a maintenance console, hoping to log my movements or check the system clocks, but every panel displayed different times, none aligning with my internal sense of duration. I tried whispering reassurance to myself, repeating Rule 6 in full, hoping it could anchor my perception. Yet even that repetition felt uneven, sometimes returning in perfect echo, other times delayed or distorted, reminding me that I was trapped in a temporal maze I could neither measure nor escape. My thoughts felt elongated, stretched thin by the rhythm of the platform, and every attempted decision was tainted by uncertainty. At one junction, I turned what I thought was a familiar corner, expecting to see the main deck, only to find the same corridor had subtly rearranged itself. My past perception of distance and time failed me. I couldn't tell whether I had walked for minutes or hours. The stairwell ahead seemed to shimmer light and shadow warping unnaturally. I whispered apologies to the space itself, begging for the illusion to relent, but the platform's patience was infinite. Rule 6, never assume a minute here is the same as a minute anywhere else, reverberated in my mind like a mantra, but even that could not stop the gnawing uncertainty that I had no idea how long I had been wandering, or if I had ever truly moved at all. The corridors continued to elongate, sometimes compressing abruptly, leaving me breathless, struggling to reconcile elapsed time with experience. I tried stopping completely, pressing myself against a wall, hoping that stillness could anchor reality, but the shadows continued to stretch and shrink, as if mocking my attempt at measurement. The beacons I had fixed earlier flickered inconsistently, some pulses lasting far longer than they should, others vanishing in a flash, reinforcing the unpredictability. My own footsteps echoed too early or too late, reinforcing that I was out of sync with the flow of this distorted time, and I began questioning whether any memory of movement was trustworthy. I tried talking aloud, narrating my actions, hoping sound could impose some linearity, but the echoes returned with subtle distortions, sometimes anticipating my next words, sometimes lagging so far behind that I feared I had already forgotten what I said. I whispered Rule 6 again, in full, hoping to anchor my perception, but the platform responded with irregular pulses of machinery and flickering lights, emphasizing the gaps between moments, teaching me that I had no reliable measure of sequence. Even my body betrayed me. The rhythm of my heartbeat and breathing had become unreliable, collapsing or accelerating without warning, making every second an unknown. Finally, I reached a junction I thought I recognized, but the corridor stretched impossibly, vanishing into darkness and light in ways I couldn't predict. My mind tried to calculate elapsed time, to reconstruct the sequence of my wanderings, but every attempt failed. Shadows pooled where they shouldn't, lights lingered longer than physically possible, and my sense of self wavered. I whispered apologies for every lapse, every misstep, every moment I hadn't observed the rules, knowing that Rule 6, never assume a minute here is the same as a minute anywhere else, applied not only to clocks, but to perception itself, and as I prepared to move forward, I realized the platform had already decided how long my next minute would feel, whether I was ready or not. I had been moving through the eastern maintenance deck when the console flashed a directive I didn't recognize, and something in my gut screamed that it was wrong. Rule 7. Never trust instructions from the central console if they contradict your senses. Drifted into my mind, a warning I had learned, but never felt so urgently. The console's screen was pristine, its lights precise, and the automated voice calm, authoritative. Yet the hum of machinery around me didn't align with the instructions. Valves that should have been active were silent, and corridors that should have been open were dark. Every instinct told me to ignore it, but my training screamed to obey. I hesitated, watching the glowing panel, feeling the first twinges of panic that came not from shadows or corridors, but from doubt in my own judgment. The voice repeated itself, steady and unwavering, while my senses rebelled against every command. I whispered aloud, trying to reassure myself, "Trust yourself, trust yourself." But even the whisper felt shaky, almost fragile against the mechanical insistence. Every nerve ending seemed on edge, a constant battle between what I saw, heard, and felt versus what the console demanded. The metallic air itself seemed to pulse with judgment, urging compliance, yet I knew deep down that Rule 7 existed precisely for moments like this. I tried verifying the directive by checking nearby panels and gauges, but they too contradicted each other. Temperature readings shifted subtly when I glanced away. Pressure levels jumped in ways I couldn't logically explain. The console's voice, steady and calm, instructed me to open a hatch I could feel was locked, yet the screen insisted it was safe. Shadows pooled beneath the hatch in ways that didn't align with the light, stretching unnaturally, almost as if mocking my hesitation. My pulse quickened as I whispered fragments of Rule 7, trying to cling to its guidance, but the creeping sensation of mistrust gnawed at me relentlessly. I remembered earlier mistakes, the shaft, the panels, the beacon, the distorted corridors, and a cold dread sank in. Every time I had assumed authority or relied on a device, the platform had subtly punished me, twisting perception and memory. Now the console's instructions felt like another test, a way to measure whether I had learned or merely survived. I whispered, "Do not follow blindly," feeling the weight of Rule 7, Never trust instructions from the central console if they contradict your senses. But even that reassurance was fragile, a thin tether against the platform's patient, calculating gaze. As I moved cautiously along the corridor, I realized the lights overhead were shifting subtly to draw me toward the hatch. The voice persisted, calm, unwavering, confident in a way that made it dangerously persuasive. I felt my hands twitch, almost moving to comply, but the hairs on my neck rose, the metallic tang in the air thickened, and I remembered the countless small betrayals the platform had orchestrated. Every instinct screamed to refuse, yet obedience felt easier, almost seductive, and I whispered quietly, trying to remind myself that Rule 7 was the shield separating trust from manipulation. I approached the hatch carefully, testing the mechanisms manually, rather than relying on the console. Each turn of the latch revealed subtle inconsistencies, misaligned gears, panels slightly out of place, air currents that shouldn't exist. My mind raced, trying to reconcile sensory evidence with authoritative instruction, realizing the platform's design exploited my reliance on hierarchy. I whispered apologies to myself, acknowledging that I had been conditioned to obey authority, and that Rule 7 was meant to break that instinct in moments when survival depended on perception over obedience. The voice on the console repeated, adding slight inflections I hadn't noticed before, emphasizing phrases that made my hesitation sound like incompetence. I froze, heart hammering, realizing the console's calm certainty was a tool, shaping my perception, pressing me to act against instinct. Shadows stretched beneath the hatch as if testing my resolve, and the metallic air felt heavier, charged with a presence that measured doubt. I whispered, "Do not trust, do not trust," each syllable a battle, an attempt to reaffirm the rule that kept me anchored against authority's deceit. I moved back slightly, hands on the walls for stability, trying to recalibrate my senses. The corridors felt narrower, more oppressive, almost as if the platform itself was aware of my hesitation. Every hum, every flicker, every metallic echo now carried a subtle weight of suggestion, and I realized with sinking certainty that blindly following the console could be far more dangerous than any shadow or distorted corridor. I whispered Rule 7, never trust instructions from the central console if they contradict your senses, embedding it in my mind as a mantra to resist the platform's subtle manipulation. By the time I reached a junction that should have led to the ventilation shaft, I realized the console's instructions had subtly altered the corridor's alignment, forcing me to navigate a path I couldn't trust. My senses screamed contradictions, each step feeling simultaneously correct and wrong. I whispered apologies for even hesitating, for every moment I had doubted, and for every time I had relied on authority over instinct. The shadows shifted again, the lights flickered, and I understood that Rule 7 existed not to punish obedience, but to preserve clarity of mind against calculated deception. I paused at the junction, trembling, aware that every sound, every movement, every echo could mislead me. The console remained lit, its calm voice unwavering, urging actions my body instinctively rejected. I whispered a final mantra, repeating the rule silently to myself, feeling its weight in my chest. Rule 7, never trust instructions from the central console if they contradict your senses. My limbs felt heavy, my mind taut with the tension of decisions that could mean survival or disaster. I knew the platform was patient, capable of waiting indefinitely for a single mistake, and the shadows seemed to lean closer, eager for that moment. I passed the eastern supply deck, where a toolbox lay half open, its contents scattered across the grated floor. For a fleeting moment, I considered simply leaving it, thinking the task trivial, and my exhaustion sufficient excuse. Rule 8, never choose convenience over protocol, even when no one is watching, flashed in my mind like a harsh spotlight, and I shivered at the memory of every minor infraction I had ignored in the past. The air felt heavier, almost accusing, pressing against my chest, as though the platform itself observed my hesitation. I realized that the shadows around me weren't merely passive, they were witnesses, cataloging each lapse in judgment, every compromise of diligence. I knelt, picking up each tool methodically, feeling the weight of past convenience-based choices settle like stones in my stomach. Every scratched panel, every slightly misaligned bolt, each time I had taken shortcuts, now loomed over me, a quiet tally of potential disasters. I whispered fragments of Rule 8 to myself, feeling it reverberate through my bones, a reminder that moral compromise had consequences, even in the smallest moments. The platform's hum seemed to deepen, pressing in rhythm with my thoughts, as if measuring my attentiveness, and I realized that survival here wasn't just about avoiding immediate danger. It was about preserving integrity, even in isolation. As I straightened the toolbox, I noticed subtle misalignments in the nearby panels, remnants of earlier negligence. Each one seemed amplified in the harsh lights of the maintenance deck, and I could feel the unspoken judgment of past mistakes pressing on my shoulders. I whispered, "I won't ignore it," forcing my hands to move deliberately, correcting every minor discrepancy, though my exhaustion screamed at me to leave. The platform seemed to respond, corridors stretching slightly, shadows pooling in places that highlighted errors, teaching me that convenience was a trap disguised as relief. Every corrected bolt, every aligned tool, felt like a small victory against the creeping moral rot the platform seemed designed to exploit. I paused, taking a breath, trying to convince myself that adherence to protocol alone could shield me. But I knew better. Rule 8, never choose convenience over protocol, even when no one is watching, had always implied cumulative weight. Every shortcut left unchecked, every small decision to ignore procedure, now echoed around me, feeding the platform's subtle manipulations. Shadows shifted as I straightened panels, almost as if approving or disapproving my choices. The humming machinery vibrated in patterns that seemed tied to my own heartbeat, reinforcing the idea that every act of negligence or diligence was noticed, cataloged, and responded to in ways I couldn't predict. As I moved to leave the deck, my mind replayed earlier moments, the flickering panels, the corridors calling my name, the malfunctioning beacon, all instances where convenience or inattention had almost led to catastrophe. I whispered fragments of Rule 8 to reinforce the lesson, knowing that my conscience was now as much a measure of survival as my eyes or ears. Even in empty corridors, I felt the weight of being observed by the platform itself, each step judged for adherence, each pause measured for intention. My body moved deliberately, slower than it wanted, aligning every motion with what I knew was right, despite the gnawing fatigue and tension. I reached a junction where a hatch had been misaligned during previous maintenance, and I hesitated briefly, tempted to bypass the adjustment for speed. But the memory of the rule anchored me. Shortcuts here could have consequences far beyond my perception. I corrected the hatch, fingers trembling, whispering apologies for every prior lapse that had led me to this point. The shadows thickened around the junction. The lights flickered just enough to make me doubt my senses, but I held to the rule, feeling its weight settle like steel around my spine. Each small adherence seemed almost physical, as if the platform recognized the effort and adjusted, subtle, unmeasured, yet unmistakable. Every corridor after that seemed subtly altered, but I noticed it only because my attention had sharpened. The platform spaces felt more aligned, the shadows slightly less intrusive, though still watchful. I realized that moral vigilance had its own form of protection, a shield against the insidious erosion of sanity and reality that had begun in earlier rules. I whispered Rule 8, never choose convenience over protocol, even when no one is watching, as a mantra, feeling the weight of accountability sink deep, a constant reminder that the platform would exploit even the smallest ethical lapses. My hands ached, my muscles screamed, but my conscience felt steadier than it had in hours. I paused in front of a panel I had previously avoided, a minor misalignment threatening operational consistency, and I felt a pang of guilt at my prior choice to ignore it. Every instinct screamed to leave it, to conserve energy, to avoid scrutiny, but the rule pressed heavily in my mind. I straightened the panel, meticulously, whispering fragments of the rule aloud to reinforce it. I realized that every ethical decision, however small, had weight here, and that the platform used even the tiniest lapse to erode trust in myself. The shadows seemed to acknowledge the correction, recoiling slightly, as if satisfied by my choice, but not granting relief, merely observation. By the time I reached a junction leading back to the central console, I was aware of how much attention had sharpened my perception. Corridors that had seemed distorted now appeared slightly less threatening, the subtle cues of shifting walls and elongated spaces easier to anticipate. I felt the quiet influence of moral vigilance, a tether to sanity amidst the chaos. Yet I could also feel the burden of what I had neglected before, the creeping anxiety that any lapse might ripple into consequences I couldn't predict. Rule 8: never choose convenience over protocol, even when no one is watching, lingered in my mind, a constant hum beneath the platform's metallic pulse, reminding me that the smallest acts carried weight far beyond immediate observation. I caught myself whispering to the empty corridor, asking whether the shadows were moving, or if I imagined it. Instantly, I remembered Rule 9. Never question the platform while alone. Your mind will supply answers you cannot trust. But the warning felt almost too late, a tether fraying as my thoughts raced ahead of my reasoning. Every reflection in the polished panels seemed distorted, not by light but by perception, and I doubted my own eyes. The hum of the machinery sounded warped, echoing in patterns I had never noticed, as if the platform itself were speaking in riddles I could not decipher. Even the flicker of the beacons I had repaired earlier seemed to pulse with meaning I could not interpret. I wandered into a maintenance alcove, trying to anchor myself with the familiar tools scattered across the floor. Each wrench, each panel seemed slightly altered from memory, and I could swear they moved when I blinked. My mind raced to rationalize the changes, but I felt the insidious creeping of self-doubt, every logical explanation slipping through my grasp, replaced with more questions. I whispered fragments of Rule 9, trying to convince myself that my suspicions were not the truth, yet each syllable seemed to echo differently than intended. The platform had become a mirror of my own fear, twisting ordinary objects into agents of uncertainty, and every step forward felt like walking through quicksand. I reached the junction where the central console should have been visible, only to find the path subtly altered, walls shifted, shadows pooling unnaturally in corners that hadn't existed moments before. I whispered aloud, "I need to focus," but the echo returned slightly distorted, reinforcing doubt instead of clarity. My memory collided with perception in violent ways, making it impossible to distinguish what had happened from what I feared had happened. Every tool I touched, every railing I leaned on, seemed to carry subtle vibrations of previous errors, amplified now by the relentless pressure of isolation. The platform didn't need to threaten me directly. It simply manipulated the very act of thought. I tried retracing my steps to a corridor I thought familiar, but the angles seemed wrong, the light subtly off. I could feel my pulse in my ears, each heartbeat a distorted drum of panic, and the shadows seemed to stretch further with each passing second. I whispered apologies to myself, fragments of Rule 9, trying to anchor sanity, but my mind began supplying answers that were frightening in their plausibility. What if the shadows were sentient? What if the platform remembered every hesitation, every lapse, and was now actively shaping my reality to ensure my failure? My hands trembled as I gripped the railing, realizing that doubt itself had become a physical presence. I attempted to cross the east deck, hoping familiarity could provide relief, but the air itself felt charged with uncertainty. Lights flickered at irregular intervals, shadows swirled just out of reach, and every corridor seemed simultaneously familiar and alien. I whispered reassurances, repeating Rule 9, never question the platform while alone. Your mind will supply answers you cannot trust, trying to keep a mental log of reality. Yet every attempt at linear thought was undermined by fleeting visions, tools slightly misplaced, reflections subtly wrong, whispers echoing without source. I realized that my mind, once reliable, had become another corridor to navigate, filled with false exits and shifting walls. I paused at a control panel, convinced it had been positioned differently moments before, and I questioned whether the shift was real or imagined. My pulse thudded painfully in my chest, and I could feel the tremor of fear amplifying my perception. Every metallic hum, every flicker, every shadow became a potential threat, and I struggled to separate cause from imagined effect. I whispered fragments of Rule 9, trying to remind myself that my own thoughts might betray me. Yet the repetition did little to reassure. The platform seemed aware of the erosion in my confidence, exploiting it with subtle alterations in light, sound, and spacing. I stumbled into a stairwell, the steps feeling elongated and compressed at impossible intervals. My reflection in the metal walls appeared distorted, sometimes showing me older, gaunter versions of myself, and I couldn't tell if fatigue or manipulation was responsible. I whispered my own name aloud, testing whether it would echo normally, but the reply arrived delayed and warped, confirming the creeping terror that my mind was no longer reliable. Rule 9 pressed on me like a physical weight, a reminder that questioning my surroundings could be fatal, yet my instincts screamed that the platform's reality had already begun seeping into my cognition. I tried to trace a previous route to a beacon I had repaired, hoping to find a grounding point, but each corridor seemed to fold back on itself. Panels were misaligned in ways my memory could not account for. Shadows moved against the flow of light, and even familiar sounds, tools rattling, machinery humming, arrived with impossible delays. I whispered apologies for questioning my own senses, murmuring Rule 9 as a mantra, yet the platform's subtle manipulations had already seeded enough doubt that I could no longer trust even the echo of my own voice. My hands shook, legs wobbled, and I realized that each step forward was an act of courage as much as necessity. Finally, I reached a junction that felt entirely unfamiliar, despite having walked here before. Shadows clung unnaturally to the corners. The floorboards reflected light inconsistently, and I began doubting my own identity, unsure if I was the same person who had repaired beacons or straightened panels hours, or was it days earlier. I whispered Rule 9, never question the platform while alone. Your mind will supply answers you cannot trust, clinging to it as if it were a lifeline. Even then, the tremor of doubt persisted, a gnawing awareness that my own cognition was no longer a safe guide, that each answer my mind supplied could be a trap. And as I prepared to move forward, a subtle shift in the shadows made me pause again, heart hammering, because something or someone was waiting for the next misstep. The corridor stretched before me, silent, except for the soft hum of machinery, yet I felt eyes watching from corners my vision could not reach. Rule 10. Never assume you are truly alone on the platform, even when it seems empty, echoed through my mind, as the shadows seemed to shift subtly whenever I blinked. I tried to convince myself it was fatigue, paranoia seeping from too many hours awake, but instinct screamed otherwise. Every metallic surface reflected light differently, as if reacting to a presence I could not see, and I felt my pulse tighten with the knowledge that the platform's isolation was a predator in itself. I crept down the narrow catwalk, each step deliberate, counting them internally to anchor reality. The faint sway of the structure amplified my unease, each mechanical groan sounding like footsteps following me. I whispered fragments of Rule 10 under my breath, trying to convince myself that even the smallest sound could reveal unseen watchers. Panels I passed seemed to have been touched recently, their alignment subtly altered, though I had no memory of doing it. I realized that the platform had become an extension of my anxiety, a space designed to exaggerate isolation and make every shadow a suspect. At a junction, I paused, hearing a faint scraping sound that made my stomach twist. I knew no one should be there. I was supposed to be alone, yet the shadows pooled unnaturally around the corners, stretching closer with each heartbeat. My gaze darted from wall to wall, searching for a source, but the air seemed dense with unseen movement. I whispered, "It's empty. It's empty," but the words felt fragile, almost futile against the creeping certainty that the platform was never truly vacant. Rule 10. Never assume you are truly alone on the platform, even when it seems empty. Weighed heavy, each repetition a feeble anchor against the swelling tide of isolation-induced paranoia. I pressed forward, fingers trailing along the railing for stability, yet every metallic echo seemed to signal someone or something tracking my movement. Shadows shifted faster than they should have, edges blurring and snapping back into alignment, creating gaps where I feared unseen eyes might dwell. I whispered apologies for every minor lapse in attention, every time I had ignored the warning that solitude could be deceptive. The platform seemed aware of my tension, feeding it back through irregular flickers of light and subtle shifts in air pressure, reinforcing the idea that isolation here was an active agent. Reaching a maintenance hatch I had passed before, I hesitated, sensing movement beyond the metal threshold. My instincts screamed not to proceed, yet my curiosity and duty propelled me forward. Each step seemed magnified, each breath uneven, as though the very act of movement attracted attention. I whispered Rule 10 again, hoping repetition could serve as a protective mantra, reminding myself that even if I could not see watchers, their presence, or my perception of it, was enough to demand caution. The shadows pooled around the hatch as I approached, thick and almost tangible, making me doubt both sight and judgment. I stepped cautiously into a narrow passage, the walls closing in subtly as though aware of my presence. Each panel I passed seemed to have been adjusted, screws slightly turned, gauges nudged out of alignment. I whispered to myself, trying to reassure my mind, yet even familiar surfaces betrayed subtle differences, hinting at unseen hands or eyes. The platform no longer felt inert. It had become an active participant in my dread, shaping corridors, light and air currents, to amplify every flicker of fear. Rule 10. Never assume you are truly alone on the platform, even when it seems empty, hung in my mind like a lit fuse, reminding me that every assumption of solitude could be deadly. At the junction near the east deck, I paused, sensing the faintest movement beyond my field of vision. Shadows pooled, twisted, and seemed almost sentient, reacting to my hesitation. I whispered apologies, telling myself that I was being irrational, yet the metallic tang in the air pressed against my senses, insisting that I was not alone. Every decision, every step carried weight, as if unseen observers were measuring my caution and hesitation. The platform itself seemed to breathe, shifting subtly to reinforce the isolation, and I realized that my own mind might be the most reliable or the most treacherous witness. I tried to reach a familiar beacon, hoping its light could offer a sense of orientation, yet the shadows ahead seemed to stretch, creating phantom corridors that had no memory in my own mind. I whispered fragments of Rule 10, trying to reinforce vigilance, but even the mantra felt fragile against the oppressive solitude. The metallic hum of machinery warped around me, pulsing unevenly, almost echoing the rhythm of footsteps I could not verify. My pulse tightened, every nerve on edge, and I realized that the mere act of thinking I might be alone had become a trap, magnifying fear beyond reason. I moved down the central catwalk slowly, counting steps and murmuring apologies for every prior lapse. Panels that should have been aligned shifted subtly as I passed, shadows pooled in corners that had been empty moments before, and the hum of machinery seemed to whisper warnings I could not understand. I whispered Rule 10, never assume you are truly alone on the platform, even when it seems empty. Feeling its weight press into my chest, I realized that isolation was both physical and psychological here, that even empty corridors could carry eyes, shadows, or memories of presence that demanded vigilance. And as I stepped toward a junction I thought I recognized, a subtle shift in light made me stop, heart hammering, because the presence I feared or imagined was already there. I paused at the junction, leading to the central console, a cold certainty pressing into my chest, and realized the shadows were watching with a patience that felt infinite. Rule 11. Never ignore the feeling that the platform wants to finish what you started, surfaced in my mind, a warning I had ignored too many times, now pulsing like a heartbeat in my skull. Every corridor I had traversed, every beacon I had repaired, every panel I had straightened, It all felt like part of a ledger the platform kept, tallying my failures and my vigilance alike. The metallic hum thickened, almost alive, pressing against my skin like a tangible entity, and I felt the weight of every previous choice accumulate into a suffocating presence. I remembered every lapse, every moment I had hesitated, ignored a minor warning, trusted my memory, or considered convenience over protocol, and realized the platform had been patient, waiting, cataloging, and now it was closer than ever. Shadows pooled unnaturally, corners that had seemed empty flickering with impossible shapes. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, irregular, jagged, syncing with some rhythm I could not detect. I whispered apologies, fragments of Rule 11, trying to anchor myself to sanity, yet each syllable felt fragile against the oppressive inevitability of the platform's will. It didn't matter whether I saw it. The sense of intent pressing down on me was unmistakable. Every step toward the console felt heavier, like walking through water, the shadows stretching to meet me, subtle yet insistent. I tried to remind myself of the earlier rules, the memory corruption, the time distortions, the authority deceptions, but they all coalesced into a single truth. The platform wasn't neutral. It didn't simply exist. It had objectives, patient and precise, and they seemed intertwined with my own survival. I whispered Rule 11, never ignore the feeling that the platform wants to finish what you started, feeling its weight in my chest like iron bands. Every breath, every heartbeat, every flicker of light was a reminder that I was both observed and measured. I reached the corridor leading to the beacon I had repaired, and it seemed subtly altered. Panels were misaligned in ways I couldn't remember, shadows pooled thicker than before, and the metallic hum pulsed with a rhythm that mimicked my own breathing. I wanted to pause, to rationalize, to remind myself that I had survived this long, but instinct screamed that hesitation was a privilege I could no longer afford. I whispered apologies for each lapse, each shortcut, each failure, realizing the platform didn't just remember, it punished, rearranged, and waited. I felt the corridors constrict subtly, the space around me compressing, yet there was no sound, no warning, only an undeniable pressure of purpose. I reached the central console, its lights glowing brighter than I had ever noticed, casting elongated shadows across the metallic floor. The voice that had issued instructions before remained silent, yet the sense of command was tangible, woven into the vibration of machinery, the subtle pull of shadows. I realized, with a sick clarity, that the platform itself could manipulate my mind, the corridors, the lights, everything, yet it demanded something from me I could not define. Rule 11 pressed against me in waves, a constant rhythm of dread, the feeling that my actions, my hesitation, my compliance or defiance, were part of a ledger that was actively shaping the present. I tried to step back, to retreat to a familiar corridor, but every hallway now looked subtly different. Panels shifted when I blinked, shadows pooled in impossible angles, even the floor seemed to breathe beneath me. I whispered Rule 11 again, feeling the mantra like a last lifeline, yet the presence pressing from the corners, from the lights, from the corridors themselves, seemed undeterred. I realized that the platform had become both judge and jury, measuring my adherence, my caution, my failures, and waiting patiently for the moment to act, to finish what had been started the moment I first set foot on its metal frame. I pressed a hand against a railing, trying to ground myself, and the cold metal seemed to pulse beneath my fingers, synchronized with my pulse. Shadows stretched and recoiled, a rhythm too precise to be random, yet subtle enough to leave me questioning reality itself. I whispered apologies for every shortcut, every reliance on memory, every ignored instruction, hoping to balance the scales, yet the sense of observation didn't fade. Rule 11, never ignore the feeling that the platform wants to finish what you started, looped relentlessly in my mind, the mantra barely keeping the dread at bay, but not dissolving it. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run, yet every corridor seemed to elongate subtly, shifting just enough to prevent escape. I realized that the platform's patience was not benign. It measured, it tested, it enforced. The shadows pooled thicker as if anticipating my next move, and I could feel a weight pressing into the small of my back, subtle, relentless, demanding attention. I whispered fragments of Rule 11, trying to assert control over what I could, but the platform seemed to counter each syllable with silence, with space, with the creeping sense that it had already begun completing its objective. As I stepped closer to the main hatch, I noticed small anomalies, panels misaligned, shadows stretching unnaturally, machinery humming slightly off-beat. My pulse accelerated, my thoughts fractured, and I realized I had become part of the platform's calculations, measured and weighed against some impossible standard. Rule 11 pressed against my mind, like ice, the feeling that every action, every hesitation, every attempt to obey or disobey was feeding into the platform's will, and that I was not free. I whispered apologies, fragments of the rule, but even as I did, a subtle shift in the corridor made me stop. Something had changed, something deliberate, and I could not see it fully, yet I felt it demanding my attention. I froze, every muscle taut, and the shadows deepened, the lights pulsed subtly, and the hum of machinery seemed to anticipate my heartbeat. My mind raced through every prior lapse, every repaired beacon, every adjusted panel, every whisper of caution, realizing that the platform had been patient for all of it. Rule 11, never ignore the feeling that the platform wants to finish what you started, vibrated in my mind, one final time, a warning that obedience, caution, and vigilance might delay, but never absolve. And then as I prepared to step forward, a subtle movement in the darkness drew my attention, and I stopped, unable to speak, because the platform's will had already claimed the next instant. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.